What we are witnessing right now with Iran isn't just an event or even a series of recent escalations. It's a culmination of decades of tension, miscalculation, and strategic maneuvering and layered conflict that has been building quietly in the background while the world focuses on more immediate crises. The relationship between the United States and Iran has been fundamentally shaped by the distrust since the 20th century. And when you add Israel into the dynamic, particularly with Iran's consistent opposition to Israel, policy, and presence, you create a multi dimensional conflict that doesn't operate like traditional wars. This isn't about clear declarations or a defined battle lines. It's about influence, pressure, and deterrence, and a perception. That's where the first major inconsistency begins to emerge. Because governments across the board consistently emphasize stability, diplomacy, and a restraint in their public messaging, yet their actions often reflect preparation, positioning, and escalation. You don't build military infrastructure and increase the regional presence and expand strategic capabilities if your primary expectation is for peace. The contradiction there between stated intention and observable action is one of the clearest indicators that this is being communicated publicly is only part of the picture. As tensions have evolved, particularly around concerns tied to nuclear capability and regional dominance, the language used by officials have become increasingly calculated. Terms like defense measures, preemptive action, and strategic deterrence are used to frame decisions in ways that feel controlled and justified. But when you examine those actions more closely, the distinction between defense and escalation becomes harder to define. If a nation conducts a strike to prevent a potential future threat, is that defense or is it initiation of conflict under a different label? What's not just a philosophical question, it's a strategic one, and it reveals another contradiction that continues to surface. Governments maintain that their actions are necessary to prevent larger conflicts, yet those same actions often increase the likelihood of a retaliation, creating a cycle that moves closer to the very outcome that they claim to be wanting to avoid. It's a feedback loop of escalation and masked by language designed to reassure rather than fully inform. Another layer that complicates the situation is the role of proxy conflict. Much of what defines the Iran situation doesn't happen directly between nations in a traditional sense. Instead, it plays out through allied groups, regional actors, and indirect engagements across the multiple countries. This creates a level of plausible deniability that allows the governments to distance themselves from certain actions while still benefiting strategically from their outcomes. Publicly, there's often a denial or a direct involvement or an emphasis on independence of these groups, but strategically, the alignment is rarely accidental. This introduces a deeper contradiction, the idea that influence can be exerted without responsibility. When outcomes align, contradictions and the idea, or I'm sorry, yeah, the contradictions, the idea that influence can be exerted without responsibility. And when the outcomes align consistently with the interests of a particular state, even without formal acknowledgement, it raises a question about how much of the narrative is being carefully shaped versus openly acknowledged. Then you move into the economic dimension, which is arguably just as powerful as the military one. The global economy is tightly connected to energy flows, and Iran sits in a region directly impacts one of the most critical oil transit points in the world. Even the suggestion of instability in that region can cause immediate and significant reactions in global markets. We've seen fluctuations in oil prices, shifts in trade expectations, and increased volatility tied directly to the perceived risk. And yet, despite these reactions, officials often describe the situation as controlled, contained, or manageable. That's a contradiction that becomes impossible to ignore when you look at how the markets behave. Markets are driven by data, risk assessment, and probability, not political messaging. So when the markets react strongly, it's often because underlying realities are more uncertain than public statements suggest. This disconnect between economic response and political reassurance is one of the clearest signals that the full scope of the situation isn't being fully communicated. International alliances add yet another layer of complexity. On the surface, there's a consistent emphasis on unity, on a coordinated response, and shared strategic goals. But beneath the surface, the reality is far more fragmented. Different countries have different priorities and different dependencies and different thresholds for risk. Some are more reliant on regional stability for economic reasons, and others are more focused on the strategic positioning, and still others are trying to balance internal political pressures with external expectations. This creates a situation where the public statements of unity can mask significant disagreements behind the scenes, and that's another contradiction that becomes important to recognize in the differences between diplomatic presentation and actual alignment. Unity is often projected because it strengthens positioning, but that doesn't mean it exists in the way it is being portrayed. The information itself has become one of the most powerful tools in this entire situation. In previous generations, governments had more control over how narratives were shaped and distributed, but today's information it moves faster and with more resources than ever before. The social media, independent analysts, leaked documents, and real-time reporting all contribute to a constantly shifting understanding of events. This creates an environment where narratives can change rapidly, sometimes within hours, and their initial statements are adjusted, clarified, or even contradicted as new information emerges. That doesn't always indicate deception. It often reflects the complexity of the situation, but it does create an environment where the consistency becomes difficult to maintain. And when consistency breaks down, trust can follow. People begin to question not just specific claims, but the overall reliability of the information they're receiving. Another critical factor is timing. When actions occur relative to statements being made, there have been multiple instances where diplomatic language has emphasized de-escalation or ongoing dialogue, while simultaneously actions on the ground suggest increased readiness or strategic positioning. This overlap creates a perception gap. On one hand, you have the messaging that suggests movement towards stability, and on the other, action that indicate preparation for continued tensions and potential conflict. This isn't necessarily accidental either. It can be strategic. Maintaining a position of strength while engaging in dialogue is a long-standing approach of international relations. But from the outside looking in, it creates a contradiction that can be difficult to reconcile. And then there's the internal dynamic within governments themselves. It's important to understand that the government is not always a single unified voice. There are different branches, different agencies, and different perspectives that all play a role in shaping policy and messaging. This can lead to situations where statements from one part of the government don't fully align with actions taken by another. The legislative bodies may push for restraints while executive branches pursue the strategic initiatives. Defense agencies may operate with the different priorities and diplomatic channels. These internal differences can create inconsistencies that appear contradictory from the outside, even when they are a result of competing priorities rather than intentional misdirections. When you step back and you look at all this together, the historical tension, the evolving strategy, the economic impact and the alliance dynamics, the information flow, and the internal divisions, you start to see a much more complete picture. This isn't a simple story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It's an ongoing process shaped by competing interests, strategic decisions, and constant recalibration. And within that process, contradictions aren't the exception, they're actually part of the structure. Governments are also balancing multiple objectives at once, maintaining security, protecting strength, avoiding escalation, managing public perception, and protecting economic stability. It's not surprising those objectives don't always align perfectly. The key takeaway here isn't that everything's being said is false or that there's some hidden agenda behind every decision, which with our government there normally is, in my opinion. It's that it's a complex situation. Like in this case, the information is layered, the messaging is strategic, and the actions don't always line up clearly with the words. Understanding what doesn't make the situation simpler, but it does make you more informed. It allows you to see patterns and recognize inconsistencies from our government, specifically in the Iran war, and approach the information you're receiving with a more critical perspective. And in a world where narratives can shape reality just as much as actions, that perspective is one of the most valuable tools you can have. And we've heard it before, most exceptionally, just think logically for yourself. Don't listen and take word for word what the government tells you, obviously. But if you made it this far and you're already ahead of most people, in my opinion, but when it comes to understanding what really is going on beneath the surface, please stay aware, question everything, and always look deeper than the headlines. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And I want to thank you once again for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens Podcast. And we'll see you in the next one. Peace.